were good soldiers. We followed orders.
It wasn't my war, and I did what I had to do to win, but somebody wouldn't let us win!
Hey, welcome back to ScreenCrush. I'm Ryan Airy, and this is all of the Easter eggs, references, and little things that you might have missed in The Bad Batch, episode 12, The Outpost. Well, that was the best episode of The Bad Batch that I have ever seen. The story, the characters, the music, just perfect. Now, I'm going to break down all the Easter eggs, but also the hidden symbolism in this episode and its roots in the real-life struggle of enlisted soldiers and veterans happening in the world right now. And I'm going to lay down some theories on how the threads of this show are all going to come together. But first, ScreenCrush, we have to praise this music. Composer Kevin Kiner is doing some of the best work of his career on this series. With every other episode, he's getting to play in a different genre or creating an homage to a different classic film. Even when the episodes have been kind of meh, he gives every moment life and character. In this episode, we return to the synthesizer-heavy tracks from Crosshair's last episode, The Solitary Clone. And now, maybe because of the setting, it made me wonder if the score was an homage to John Carpenter's The Thing. We open on the former clone base on Coruscant where the clone troopers are being retired. Now, the show has been building up to this for 2 seasons. In season 1, Tarkin and Rampart decided to phase out the clone program and strip it for parts, illegally destroying Tipoca City and,
destroyed my civilization.
And then in that 2-part politics episode, the Senate passed a bill that funded an army of conscripted troops, while also paying for the clones' retirement.
Tell me how to help, and I will make sure Admiral Rampart's bill meets your needs.
The first line of this episode is an Imperial bureaucrat repeating a scripted speech to the soldiers.
The Empire thanks you for your years of service and wishes you well on your retirement.
And the clones' follow-up line,
Forced retirement.
spells out the theme of this entire episode. So you have a human being being machine-like, repeating the same phrase over and over, the sort of behavior you would expect from a clone, while the clone makes it clear that he wants to keep fighting and to be of service.
What are we supposed to do now?
Showing that the clone is actually acting more human than the natural-born human. You see, every clone was created with the same baseline, meant to be obedient.
They are totally obedient, taking any order without question.
But as we saw all through the Clone Wars, the clones came to embrace individualism. They gave each other nicknames, changed their appearance, or even questioned the war.
I like to think I'm merely exercising my freedom to choose. To choose not to kill for a living.
We even saw one clone, Slick, betray the Republic because it's what he thought was best for his brothers.
It's the Jedi who keep my brothers enslaved.
In fact, this series is about the clone's struggle for individualism as exemplified by the Bad Batch. But not every clone strays so far from their original programming. Captain Wilco obeyed his orders to a fault, so Rampart treated him like a disposable unit. And these clones are also being treated like old tools. And the troopers that are patrolling this airfield are regular TK troopers who were conscripted into the Empire. You can tell by the Gen 1 Stormtrooper helmets.
That was fast. Didn't that just pass that law?
Yes, but the Empire was already drafting and recruiting non-clone soldiers. We saw this last season when Gregor was charged with training the regular TK troopers toward the end of season 1. So Crosshair's watching all this happen, and think about everything this guy has given to the Empire. He turned against his own family, scarred his flesh up, watched them destroy his birthplace, then they locked him up for suspected disloyalty, and then he still follows orders to the letter, like when he killed the magistrate in Solitary Clone.
So much for peace.
Now, this is the same Coruscant clone base that we've seen throughout this season. You can even see the clone memorial wall right here. Although it wouldn't surprise me if the Empire just removed the wall altogether pretty soon because it only existed to give the clones a morale boost. If the clones are now legally classified as obsolete tools, then keeping the memorial would be like making a shrine to a broken hammer.
Hey.
Sorry, Doug, I forgot about your broken hammer shrine.
It's okay. Hammy knows you didn't mean that.
Now, note the framing here too, with the clones in civilian clothes walking out while the new TK troopers are walking in. And then we meet the villain of this episode, Lieutenant Nolan, who was named after Christopher Nolan because Dave Filoni hates his living guts.
Oh my gosh, really?
No, not really. No, I just made that up. I have no idea how Dave Filoni feels about Christopher Nolan. But hey, Christopher Nolan, I did hear that Dave Filoni really wants to beat you up by the dumpster outside. He says that you're too chicken and do something about it, or like that your movies all have like the same theme or something like that. I don't know. You should probably go to the dumpster after work and like talk to him about it. Anyways, Lieutenant Nolan is a real piece of work. Notice he greets Crosshair with his number and is aghast that he is not conforming.
You're out of uniform.
Right away, this sends a message that he does not want Crosshair to show any individuality or express himself as a person. He says,
I don't like used equipment.
Now, we did see this same attitude from a Jedi general during the Clone Wars. Pong Krell also saw clones as disposable.
I find it very interesting, Captain, that you are able to recognize the value of honor for a clone.
And just like Nolan, he was fragged by his men.
What do you mean he was fragged? What's that mean?
Well, fragging is a term that originated in the Vietnam War. It's when an officer mistreated his men, so the soldiers would roll a fragmentation grenade into their tent. Some estimates say that more than 80 officers were killed this way during that war, and for reasons like we see in this episode. Officers were often college educated, they came from a higher class of wealth, and had seen far less combat than the enlisted men. And we see all of this repeated in this episode.
And in the movie Platoon.
That's right. So Nolan and Crosshair head off for Barton 4, an ice planet that actually bears a striking resemblance to Renvar, the ice planet that we saw in the original Star Wars Battlefront games. Now, this remote location is the perfect setting for this type of story. For one, it's hard to watch this episode and not think of John Carpenter's The Thing. If you've never seen it, this movie is a must-view. It's about a remote American research station in the Antarctic that is infiltrated by a shape-shifting alien. As the crew members are slowly picked off, the structure and hierarchy of the base slowly disintegrates. This is also seen in Vietnam films like Apocalypse Now. When Colonel Kurtz is left alone in the jungle, he retreats into madness.
Horror has a face, and you must make a friend of horror.
Essentially, when people become geographically isolated from their institutions at an outpost like this, the rules of that institution stop reflecting their day-to-day reality. Mayday says,
"We expected you 36 rotations ago."
So the reality of the troops on this base is pretty far from the procedures they taught Nolan at the academy. As they exit the ramp, notice that Nolan slips a little. One of the clone troopers tries to steady him and he pushes him away. This is a great little detail to show how condescending he is to these troops. He doesn't even want them to touch him. To him, they are things.
I don't like used equipment.
The droids inside the base look like a cross between the Imperial Assassin droids and the KX security droids. The broad shoulders especially look like the KX droid, so I'm going to assume this is an early model of your mom. But guys, if we've seen this droid model before, don't keep it a secret, let me know down in the comments. And then we meet the commander of this base, Mayday. Now, Mayday is an international distress call for help, so we could say that it's appropriate that he has this name because his base needs help. But I think that before he was stuck on this outpost, he got the nickname Mayday because he was the guy that other people called when they needed help. When the lieutenant tries to pull rank, Mayday corrects him.
We work on the Empire's schedule, Trooper, not yours.
It's Commander.
And even though technically Mayday outranks Nolan, they both know who's really in charge. This is because Mayday is a clone, and Nolan is a natural-born citizen of the Empire. In other words, the life of a normal human is always worth more than the life of a clone. Clones don't even have representatives in government.
Which one belongs to the clones?
Clones do not have representation in the Senate.
And Nolan holds his position even though he has never commanded a single mission.
Tell me, Lieutenant, how many missions have you commanded? That's what I thought.
Now notice that they're surrounded by the helmets of the dead clones, a kind of memorial like the one we saw at the start of this episode. These empty clone helmets are also an ironic statement. They rest on crates filled with new TK Trooper helmets. Helmets that these clone troopers have just died to defend just so they could be replaced by the helmets they were defending. Now, the clones don't even know what's in these boxes.
What's in the box?
And they haven't checked inside because it's against orders. This is the ultimate end of the life of a clone. Blindly following orders to protect something that's only going to replace you. Outside, we get our first look at this space bird of prey. Now, we never see it attack, but Mayday says,
"Vicious creatures, but you have to admire them. They find a way to survive."
Now, the bird of prey is very important to this episode, symbolically and literally. Consider that this bird represents Crosshair's true nature and free will. The bird is a deadly predator, just like Crosshair. And even though Crosshair follows orders like a good soldier, there is always going to be part of him that is a vicious killer, waiting to strike of his own accord. But at the start of this episode, the bird is obscured, a silhouette, just like Crosshair's true nature stays hidden. Then the Raiders strike, and Crosshair has him in his sights on his infrared scope. And then this happens.
Yeah, why'd he do that? Why'd he take his helmet off?
Because the sudden light of the explosion seen with his infrared hurt his eyes, especially with his advanced senses.
Oh, okay.
There's also a recurring theme of this episode of characters removing their helmets so they could better see the world around them, both literally and metaphorically.
Oh, okay, that's cool. Alright.
Alright, so Mayday and Crosshair track the troops to an ice cave where they find one of the dead raiders. Crosshair says,
"No point in carrying dead weight."
And this is showing how initially Crosshair and the Empire have a similar viewpoint. Crosshair views combat as only practical. If the soldier can't fight, they are useless, while Nolan sees a live clone in the same way. So this idea that the clones are tools and have low value reminded me of a term from World War II, Isengoran. This is a Japanese word that translates basically to penny postcards, and it was used by the High Command to describe their enlisted soldiers. It means that their recruits were only as valuable as the postage it took to send a letter to draft them, or if they died, then they were only worth the postage it took to send a letter to their families. So this term has come to mean that all people in military command who don't value the everyday trooper, like what the Empire is doing to clones. Now that they have the TK troopers, clones are entirely expendable. But Mayday doesn't see his brothers that way, and he works to save Crosshair. And in his short speech here, we kind of spell out why there is hope for the clones, because no matter what, they will always develop individuality.
I've learned to improvise, though. I guess all clones have had to since the war.
So take a larger view of this statement. We saw in Attack of the Clones that the clone troopers were meant to be identical and obedient.
They are totally obedient, taking any order without question.
But the situation on the battlefield was very different from what the Kaminoans planned for. So the clones improvised and embraced their individuality. But now they're at a crossroads where individuality is being forced upon them.
Can't say I ever thought much about the war ending.
This scene is also very personal for Crosshair because it's really rare that he has to put his life into the hands of someone else. He's a sniper, he hangs back, but here it takes total faith in his clone brother to come back alive. But still, Mayday doesn't take any chances.
I'll wait around the bend. If I don't hear a boom, then I'll know it worked.
We also see Crosshair trying to keep his emotional distance from Mayday. When he asks about his unit, Crosshair changes the subject.
What happened to them?
They're gone.
Because he doesn't want to think about his brothers in Clone Force 99. Then they attack the Raiders camp, where Kevin Kiner really gets to shine. Among other weapons, they use a shock grenade on the troopers, and they're carrying electro stabs like Grievous's Magna Guards. The whole fight is awesome, and the music, as Magneto would say,
perfection.
Crosshair gets pinned down until he detonates a stack of the same landmines that Mayday just worked to defuse. And then, ironically, Mayday is still killed by a landmine, just not right away. After the collapse, they take off their protective helmets.
In a blizzard? Why would they do that?
So they can see better, because trooper helmets don't have the best visibility.
I can't see a thing in this helmet.
And this, guys, is irony writ large. These troops died protecting gear that would have prevented them from dying. But this gear is not for clones. It's for the new troopers that are coming to replace them. It's like the old joke of the man who's on his deathbed and he wants a cookie, but his wife says, no, those are for the funeral.
Put that cookie down now!
This moment is too much for Mayday, and he repeats the clone mantra.
We're good soldiers. We followed orders.
Now, you'll remember that these are the words the troopers uttered when the control chip in their heads activated Order 66.
Good soldiers follow orders.
And these are the words that caused Crosshair to break from the rest of Clone Force 99.
Good soldiers follow orders.
And just as Mayday says,
and for what?
An avalanche comes to bury them. The world's biggest, coldest metaphor since the iceberg that hit the Titanic.
The ship will sink.
This avalanche is an allegory for the might of the Empire coming down on the clones to bury them. Now, Crosshair is seeing how the Empire treats clones, and he's got to be wondering, why am I still loyal to these scumbags? Mayday says,
go.
And then Crosshair has to make that decision. Is this guy dead weight, or is he a person? Crosshair realizes that he owes this man a debt, just like how the Empire owes the clones a debt for their service. And this scene was really touching, and it reminded me of something a Nomvet once told me, that when you're in the jungle, your pack would get so heavy you would want to die. But one thing that never got heavy was your buddy when you had to carry him on your back. Crosshair puts on his helmet, note the pressurized sound it makes, just like the sound Vader's helmet and the Mandalorian's helmets make. So now they're two dudes in a Jack London novel trying to get out of the cold. They finally get home after the blizzard and see dozens of transports landing. These are troops that could have easily attacked the base of the Raiders like the next day, but Nolan insisted that they go out that same night.
This task falls to you two, and you two alone.
All of these troopers are human conscripts, the TK troopers that are going to replace the clones, and they are bringing crate after crate after crate of the same gear that Mayday just died to find. And what does Nolan call him?
The waste of the Empire's resources.
And even worse,
he served his purpose.
Goran, a soldier whose life is barely worth the stamp that it took to recruit him. And Crosshair isn't just mad at Nolan. Here, he's mad because he recognizes a bit of Nolan in himself. He sees that same cold detachment in how he treated Mayday, Cody, and the rest of the Bad Batch. And then he sees the shadow of the bird, and here we have to talk about the metaphor of Plato's cave. Plato wrote about a man who was chained inside of a cave. All he could ever see was his own shadow on the wall. So he assumed that the shadow was the real world and all that existed, never even suspecting that there was a greater world outside the cave. So the metaphor is about how our interpretation of the outside world can blind us to the truth of the world. In this case, that Crosshair's blind adherence to the Empire has masked the fact that the Empire does not value him at all. He looks up, sees the real bird, and that releases the predator inside of him, and he frags his officer. And then, in a beautiful twist, he wakes up in Mount Tantus, the cloning facility where our new villain, Dr. Hemlock, is in command. Last episode, Hemlock learned that to force Nalisae's cooperation, he had to capture Omega, and now Crosshair is captive on Mount Tantus as well. Maybe they'll use him to capture the Bad Batch, or maybe they'll use his DNA for some unholy clone experiment that'll eventually lead to this.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
I think personally what's going to happen here is that Sid is going to sell out the Bad Batch, and then Omega will end up being taken to Mount Tantus, and then hopefully Crosshair rejoins his team and turns against the Empire. So like I said, I love this episode, not just for how it works as a Star Wars story, but how it highlights the problems that our veterans are facing in the real world today. But let me know what you thought of the episode down in the comments below, where you can @ me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe and smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Airy.